get started. Again, thank you for coming. My name's Dan Nickey. I'm your host today. I'm with the Iowa Waste Reduction Center. Again, the goal here is to elevate the conversation and have a discussion. So please don't be a bump on a log. We really want participation. The speakers, we are missing one of our speakers, I'm sorry to say. I hope he's not gotten in a tractor accident or anything. But Bryan from AgriReNew, who has a biodigestion facility on his farm, is not able to attend today. So we're down one speaker, but I think we can make it work. But we have a great panel. We have Dr. Greg Just, Associate Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Iowa. We have Shelly Peterson, PE, who's a Program Manager at the Iowa Economic Development Authority's Energy Program. And we have Brad, if I pronounced your name wrong, Brad Pleima.
Yeah,
Sorry.
there you go.
President of EcoEngineers. So, how the forum is going to work today? Again, we're trying to keep this not very formal. Each presenter is going to be given 7 to 10 minutes to talk about the topic. And our topic today is the future of RNG as an energy source in Iowa. And what we mean by RNG is renewable gas. That could be RNG could be something coming off a landfill. It could be coming off a biodigester. It's just a renewable gas, not natural gas coming out of the ground. So basically, we're going to talk about the future of RNG as an energy source in Iowa. You know, we're talking about renewables. We always think about solar. We think about wind. But wait a minute, we're creating all this RNG in our landfills and our wastewater treatment plants. And we can also manufacture it in biodigesters. So can this be a possible energy source for the future? So, that being said, that's the wrong Bryan we're looking for. So, that being said, we are going to start off. With someone that doesn't have a presentation, so I get time to get it up. Shelly.
Yep. So, good morning, thanks for coming. As Dan mentioned, Shelly Peterson, I'm with the State Energy Office. And we've been kind of looking at this topic for the last 7 or 8 years. I'm going to give a little bit of history of some of the things we've been doing. And then the focus for the future, I think the gentlemen on either side of me have got some good thoughts to share on where we can go with RNG. Our office writes what's called the State Energy Plan. It hadn't been updated for a while. In 2016, we did an update on that. And one of the many things that we heard from stakeholder groups and in looking at data and numbers was, gosh, we've got to make sure we're tapping Iowa's biomass resources. And that group made the recommendation to do a biomass conversion action plan. So we started on that pathway, and we were getting some help from EcoEngineers, the firm Brad is with. They did a visual biogas asset map that really could help you pull out where those feedstocks could come from, anywhere from animal waste to food manufacturers, of course, to all the crops we've got in Iowa. So it was a good resource that could really kind of help you visualize we've got a lot of potential. And at this time, there were really only 3 on-farm digesters that I knew of. Bryan Sievers, another one at Amana Farms, and a real small one in Northeast Iowa. In addition to maybe a handful of aerobic digesters at wastewater treatment facilities. And it's not that it was a new technology. Anaerobic digestion's been around, especially in that wastewater field, for more than a century. So it's just that why aren't we using it here in Iowa? What's the value proposition? So EcoEngineers also did an economic impact study. What's the job creation potential? How can if we promote biogas projects, what's the economic potential? And the numbers looked good back at that time. Around 2017. The committee that helped write the Biomass Conversion Action Plan finished up work, and we published a report on that. One sector that we really wanted to key in on was the pork industry. We hadn't yet seen any digesters at pork facilities. There's something like near 30 million hogs in the state of Iowa. Like, I mean, seriously, almost 10 times as many pigs as people. You know, how can we capitalize on that? And then growth in that industry was being limited by the ability to deal with manure, you know, and the animal wastes. And so we kind of wanted to look at it holistically. It's not just energy. Renewable natural gas is a whole lot more. And back in this time, those digesters that we're operating, we're selling, we're using that gas in a combined heat and power unit or a generator to generate electricity and then selling it back to the grid. That was kind of the business model at that time. Around that 2018 timeframe, Iowa State University also worked with Bryan Sievers on his farm. He had begun to mix cover crops in his feedstock. He has like a 2,400 head cattle operation, scrapes that manure into some above ground digesters. And he was starting to mix cover crops in there, you know, for multiple reasons. It increases the gas potential for the the amount of gas that comes off of the unit. That was one of the reasons. You know, and a really interesting piece is, gosh, can that be a way to motivate farmers to plant more cover crops, which has a water quality benefit as well. So Iowa State University did a little life cycle cost analysis on his project. Another thing going on in that era, DNR was looking at their on-farm permitting requirements for digesters. You know, it's still the same manure that they would land apply, and it was a bit controversial at the time. You know, do you have to handle it differently? Is it regulated differently? So they worked through that, and I think everybody came away happy, you know, with the outcome on how the DNR could regulate these farm digesters, largely due to a lot of collaboration between people like Bryan Sievers and EcoEngineers and people in the industry to really understand what's being done on the farm so that the DNR then could regulate it appropriately. 2019 timeframe, you know, we're looking at renewable natural gas in terms of its carbon value at this point in time. And EcoEngineers crunched some numbers on, gosh, what if ethanol plants in the state were using renewable natural gas? The value to them is then their ethanol was worth more on the market. So I think we're kind of starting to see some projects like that happen now, where there is, I think it's a jet fuel manufacturer is using renewable natural gas as part of their how they determine the carbon value of their jet fuel. I think that one's across the border in Minnesota, but it's really close to Iowa.
They buy gas from
yeah. So, and the gas comes from Iowa. That was kind of an interesting time frame. I call it the time frame when developers were falling out of the sky. Brian Sellinger, our team leader, and I, we got, gosh, at least like one call a week from a developer from a state who probably had never talked to anybody from Iowa before, and hey, do you know a farmer? It's like, oh yeah, I know a farmer. I live in Iowa. You know, so it was kind of what's the state's role as all these potential developers were kind of getting hot on the market. And so our kind of standard answer, you know, well, we've got some reports on our website, please, you know, just go look at that, at those reports. So I think we kind of knew we were on to something then because of this attention that was coming in. The city of Des Moines and the city of Dubuque's wastewater treatment facilities around that time frame connected to the natural gas pipeline. So they're no longer selling electricity, they're selling natural gas, you know, as it comes off of their digesters. They've got to clean it and inject it into the pipeline. And the reason they did that was because the economics of the situation were changing and they could get a better price for that in a gas form as opposed to electricity. Brad will probably cover more on you know, how those markets work, but they were definitely evolving about that time frame. About 2020, Craig just enters the picture, at least on our end. We funded a project called Iwerp, the Iowa.
Yeah, it's kind of down there in the bottom.
That, which he chose the very attractive name Iwerp for.
Yeah. Well, when it becomes a center, it'll be Iwerk.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's just
yeah,
foreshadowing.
All right, so there's a reason there. So one of the focuses of Craig's project is municipal wastewater treatment plants and how they can capitalize on renewable natural gas, enhance the production, and also he's offering some laboratory services that weren't previously available, and we thought was important to have in the state. I'll let him cover that one more in the future. 2021, the governor convened a carbon sequestration task force. So we're now talking about carbon. You know, everybody's talking about carbon. And renewable natural gas, it was a small piece of the conversation, but definitely a piece. And as we focus on, we've got to begin to value carbon. So, especially, you know, the on-farm systems, they've got a lot of nutrients in that digestate that's left over out of the digester. And being able to put that carbon back on the soil, it's a soil enhancer, and it's part of this agricultural carbon cycle that we're trying to get a handle on. Iowa State University wrote a really good carbon science report for us in that time frame, and they're continuing to kind of explore all things carbon, especially on that ag front. We also published an anaerobic digester resource guide. Again, EcoEngineers helped us on that front. So that brings us to last year, 2022. One of the first new on-farm digesters began operation in northwest Iowa. I think it combines manure from 3 separate dairy farms, and that is the fuel that then is used by the Minnesota Sustainable Aviation Fuel Project. So you know, I really think we've been gearing up for things. I think that was the tipping point. Another project I just read that's in the works is a project to combine waste from 25 hog farms in the Wright County area with 70 miles of gathering line is going to connect that raw feedstock. And the reason being is then it's expensive to clean this natural gas. So if you can accumulate it and bring it to a central source, it's a more economical way to do it. Iowa's farms, especially our hog farms, are medium-sized. Other states like North Carolina, they've got really big farms. They can have the entire operation within a single hog farm. But here in Iowa, you know, we've had to deal with the fact that, gosh, our feedstocks are a little bit more dispersed.
Great.
And we've got to find a way to bring them together.
Well, so that's a great overview of what's been going on over the last couple of years, and it's a great way to go into the next 2 speakers. Craig, I'll let you go next. Craig Just from University of Iowa, got your presentation up, and let you go.
I'm from Wright County, so that's a great transition as well. And I guess I love to hear the timeline, and I think part of what my program hopes to do is to keep us up at this new higher level and provide some of the resources to sustain that. I will say this is about renewable natural gas, but the other part of that is rural wastewater, also big city, I guess, as big as they get in Iowa for wastewater too. So I tried to put my thoughts together here. It's just a single slide. I'm not going to give a presentation by any means. And to that first point about keeping these digesters going, what I've seen, and I have worked with the Manna Farms, I did a pilot study with them, but mostly I've been on the municipal side, particularly with co-digestion, so places like Muscatine, Iowa, Sioux City, Iowa, that take in waste organics from a variety of sources. So in Muscatine, for example, They'll take waste organics that are off spec from like Heinz Kraft, Oscar Mayer, Purina dog biscuits that show up in these places. They take pre-consumer waste from Hy-Vee delis and things like that. If those organics end up in the landfill, you're going to make methane. It's going to get released. If instead you put those organics in a digester, you can get some commodity value and also some greenhouse gas reduction value from that. But what I've seen in these projects is we're kind of flying blind. We don't know how to do co-digestion very well at municipal sites. They were never designed to do that in the first place. They're just designed to kind of hang out, do their thing, kind of 30-day time scales. And yet we put this nacho cheese waste in there, and all of a sudden you got rocket fuel for digesters, and our workforce, our operators don't know what to do. And so it's a bit of a, kind of, well, how much nacho cheese should I put in today? Like, how much Oscar Mayer sausage should I put in today? It's really this ad hoc approach. And what we end up getting from that then is digester upsets. If you put in the wrong things, just like you put the wrong stuff in your human anaerobic digestion system, you'll get an upset stomach. But also then with risk avoidance, with upset avoidance, you don't get as much methane. You don't feed it as hard as you could. And so we want to be able to do, support these feedstock and operational decisions. But also, if you need to take a Tums when you have an upset stomach, what type of supplements can we use to recover from a digester upset and or keep these digesters moving along? And as Shelly mentioned, we've got some gear. We've got little mini anaerobic digesters in the lab. We can do some of this work. The data there shown in that first upper left part of the slide is data from Amana Farms and some work we did with them. Speaking of that, going to the right, real-time sensing and analytics. So what's in that feedstock, right? You make this, what we would call a high-strength waste from all these organics that you don't want to go to the landfill. They come in different pallets and shipments each day. Well, what did you make that day? We want to take real-time fingerprints of the composition of that of those waste organics, so that then we can inform the operators in real time, how much should you put in today? You don't have you've got to make decisions on these daily timescales. These plants were never designed to do that. And so we're working with Buki and Valkyrie Analytics to provide that real-time information needed so we can help support smart operational decisions. Another way to support smart decisions are these using machine learning and digital twin concepts. So I have a grant funded from the EPA now that's creating a digital twin at the Muscatine Water Resource Recovery Facility. That digital twin currently is fed data from what's called their SCADA system, supervisory control and data acquisition. So they've got a lot of real-time data already from sensors, temperatures, flows, different things like that. We made a direct connection to the Muscatine facility. We put their data in our cloud system, and then we use machine learning to chomp on that data and figure out which maybe top 10 signals of 400 possible signals predict biogas. And we can predict biogas unbelievably well from their existing data. We can couple that then with the lab data that they collect. They get grab samples and record things manually. That's also very predictive of biogas formation. The more challenging part is to predict an upset. Upsets are rare, and so you don't get very much training data for your machine learning approach, right? You need to have lots of data to train these machine learning models, but we're working on that. Part of that will be with the Tippy College of Business. The business analytics folks there are well trained in these types of techniques as well. And our machine learning models will get a lot better if we couple it with these real-time sensing techniques. So that's really a lot of stuff that I like to do. Applied research and learning. Let you know we're going to do an anaerobic digestion on the farm conference November 6th through the 8th. I work a lot with Iowa State University. They got a lot of shout outs here for all that on-farm stuff. Lisa Schulte Moore is amazing at their Bioeconomy Institute, working with Bryan, Sievers, and others. And so we'll be there. It's sponsored also by EPA Region 7. And so really trying to get the dialogue about anaerobic digestion on the farm out there, but also educating folks. And in fact, during the time of abstract submittal and registration, we'll ask if you're a beginner, kind of an intermediate person, or an expert, because we really want to grow the community. And so we want to target that conference toward different user groups with respect to anaerobic digestion. So local and global collaboration, I've been promoting something that I call the Iowa Methane Initiative. That's a University of Iowa focused initiative with 6 different colleges on campus, including our environmental law initiative that we've got, again, Tippy College of Business, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, so on and so forth. Really trying to make Iowa and our ability, we should be #1 in methane production in the world. We have the feedstocks, we just heard about that. And so our ability then to mitigate our own methane emissions, which are highest in agricultural settings, everyone knows that. Well, let's do it the best here and then start from here and spread it around the world, why not? And speaking about spreading it around the world, the Global Methane Hub, one of our alums is the CEO of that, and Marcelo Mena will be one of the keynote speakers at the AD conference in November. The Global Methane Hub recognizes that methane in the atmosphere can much more quickly have a climate change mitigation impact than CO2. It doesn't live in the atmosphere as long as CO2. So if we can get our act together in the next decade with respect to methane, we can slow that global temperature rise. And again, why not Iowa? I mean, we can do it here. And so it just goes to show that what we do here can have then global impacts. Thankfully, we got Brad here because I have a giant question mark about profitability and markets. That's voodoo to me. I have no idea who's pulling the levers behind the curtain in these carbon markets. I've gotten, or I said Brad, well, maybe I said Brad. Anyway, been getting some education from EcoEngineers on this. And, but when I start to think about it, and when I start talking to the Tippy College of Business as well, profitability includes feedstock acquisition costs, could be greenhouse gas emission costs. It's not just about the engineers maximizing methane production. You might take a decreased amount, maybe a 5 or 10% decrease in methane production if the feedstocks you can get to achieve that are cheaper, for example, right? I don't know how to optimize for all of those types of variables. Other people do, and that's where you almost need to have an MBA along with your engineering degree, along with your social science degree to put all this together. And so that speaks to the profitability of it because it's not going to go. I mean, one thing I do agree with respect to our plenary speaker, I agreed actually with quite a bit what he had to say, but again, not the overall perspective that he shared, very narrow view. But the profitability part of it, I mean, if it's not profitable, it's not going to happen. It just isn't. I mean, we can subsidize our way into getting maybe a market produced or created, but if it's not profitable, it's not going to go. And so I am determined to be able to provide the support needed to make this profitable and to gain back those environmental benefits that we can get from it. So
Right.
that's what I do in a nutshell.
Well, it looks like he already introduced you, Brad.
Yeah,
that's
Brad,
great.
so turn it over to you.
Yeah, no,
Brad?
great. Good. Thanks for everyone for coming. Brad Pleima with EcoEngineers, and we're a renewable energy consulting and auditing firm that's 100% focused on decarbonization and emissions reduction. So that we work a lot in renewable natural gas. It's one of the fastest growing areas of renewable energy sources in the country and really in North America. We also do a lot of work on other liquid fuels, ethanol and biodiesel, sustainable aviation fuel. Hydrogen is another interesting thing that everyone is talking about. And can you make renewable hydrogen, green hydrogen? The great thing about RNG can actually be a feedstock for hydrogen production to offset the natural gas that is used. And maybe I wanted just to start out of why RNG? Why is it good? Why would we use it? We have challenges. Like you have to get feedstock, you have to bring it to a central location. It's expensive. Digesters are not the easiest things to operate. I think Craig did a good example of like your stomach is really just a digester. And so that's all that the organic waste is coming in, just doing at a large scale. You might build a couple million gallon tank, bring in a bunch of materials, but how do you optimize that and how do you produce it is certainly an issue in the industry. There's just not a lot of precedent. What do you say, 5, 6, 10 digesters in the entire state of Iowa. So when you're saying, when we're out in the industry preaching the benefits of doing renewable natural gas projects, building anaerobic digesters or upgrading that biogas to renewable natural gas, there's just not a lot of experience from operations, from design, from equipment manufacturers. So it's taken that long of a time frame to get people to, one, understand what the opportunity is, and then two, to figure out how to efficiently do it. Because the last thing anyone wants to do is go spend, $50 million or $100 million on a project and it doesn't work, right? There's examples of those out there, and that's what everyone is afraid of, and really need to see that precedent that has been set. And I think the renewable natural gas industry over the last 10, 15 years has dramatically grown, and talk a little bit why we see that as the case, but just the benefit of renewable natural gas and why do it is it can replace fossil natural gas in the pipeline as a feedstock source. It can also be used as a feedstock for electricity production, for hydrogen production. There's a lot of different benefits that this biogas or renewable natural gas has. The other big one is the carbon intensity. The emissions associated with renewable natural gas are significantly less than emissions associated with burning fossil natural gas in the pipeline. So just to throw some numbers at you, the natural gas we all burn at our houses or in our businesses to heat our homes, to light our stove, has a carbon intensity score of around 70 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. Doesn't mean a lot on a standalone, but that's how much 70 grams of CO2 equivalent when you burn a unit of that gas in your home. That's what the total life cycle emissions are. From pulling it out of the ground, from oil production, from transporting it to you, for your stove to combust it in your house, or your boiler or your water heater to combust that in your house. That's the emissions factor. If we use renewable natural gas, that can be at a waste from a landfill, that can reduce those emissions by about 50%. So anywhere from 35 to 50 grams of CO2 equivalent is the carbon intensity of landfill gas. So by taking something that the landfill is already producing anyway, they were probably just flaring it and burning it off, or maybe using it on site for some heat. You can now refine that, upgrade that, stick it into the pipeline like Des Moines is doing, and then now that's an equivalent volume of that gas doesn't need to come out of the ground. And so we're seeing that emissions reduction profile at that 50% level from landfills. Wastewater treatment plants are actually a little bit better than that. They can be in that 10 to 30 CI score range. So now you're replacing that 70 with something that's say 20. So again, a pretty big emissions reduction from consumption of that natural gas, just by using something that many large cities already have and are already doing. And then if we get into these on-farm digesters, why is everyone talking about dairy farms and swine farms? It's because the common disposal of that manure is you dump it into a big lagoon or you dump it into a big pit and you just let it sit there. Well, what happens is there's anaerobic digestion happening and that methane is just being emitted directly into the atmosphere. So the emissions at that specific farm are actually pretty bad. Not only do you have the consumption of the emissions associated with combusting electricity, now you just have fugitive methane emissions from this manure. So what people are doing and realizing there's programs that now capitalize on this, let's stop that. Let's cover that lagoon, or let's put all that material in a digester. Now you're saving all of that methane emissions reduction that's going into the atmosphere, and you're displacing a fossil-based fuel. So the carbon intensity scores of those projects can be -200 to -400. So now you're actually net removing carbon from the atmosphere because of that methane avoidance by producing RNG. That's a huge benefit and something that there's not that many options out there. We look at ethanol, great big ethanol state here. It's a great thing. You can really only blend about 10 to 15% ethanol into transportation fuel. Renewable natural gas, you can displace 100% of it. If we had enough fuel, if we had enough RNG, we could replace 100% of the natural gas consumption in Iowa. That probably won't happen because there's just limitations with feedstock, economics, and there's certain hurdles that people aren't going to invest in projects that aren't profitable. But that's what the potential for RNG and the value that RNG can bring from an emissions reduction standpoint. And how do these projects get done and how do they get built? It's really relying on back-end carbon markets in order to do that. It's expensive to build a digester, it's expensive to upgrade it, it's expensive to operate it. You have to compress it and put it into the natural gas pipeline. All of the things that Craig and Shelly talked about, you have to overcome. Someone's got to pay for that. And the commodity that you're producing, the RNG molecules, they're exactly the same. The methane molecules are what's in the pipeline, but the pipeline is probably 1/5 or 1/8 of the cost. So that's why everyone's using fossil gas. It's much, much cheaper. RNG is still an expensive entity to do on its own. Well, what has happened, there's been programs both federally and at the state level that have lessened that blow. So the Renewable Fuel Standard, or the RFS, from the federal program administered by the EPA, it rewards RNG and it rewards other carbon reduction, just like ethanol. And they will give you a per gallon, per unit value, per gallon credit from producing RNG and using that as transportation fuel. The state of California has a low carbon fuel standard called the LCFS program that does the same way, or does the same thing, but it actually rewards that efficiency in the carbon intensity score. So that program is going to pay a lot more for that dairy or that swine farm because of that highly negative carbon intensity score, compared to that landfill, who it's still good, it's not as good from a carbon profile that the dairy RNG and the swine RNG are. So again, we're sitting here in Iowa with a ton of hogs. There's a moderate amount of dairy cows up in Northwest Iowa as well. And I think people are putting all of this together, and that investment is happening across the country. So about 10 years ago, there was probably 15 active RNG production facility projects, not biogas producers, but actually upgrading that gas and sticking it into the pipeline. There's now over 200, and there will be probably close to 500 in the next three years across the United States. Growing in Iowa, growing nationally, and they're really using these carbon markets in order to do that. The other big advantage that RNG has that, say, liquid fuel may not, is when you stick it into the pipeline, the industry recognizes this concept called book and claim. So if I produce Des Moines, if they produce natural gas and inject it in the pipeline, the San Diego bus system could buy that RNG, and they're buying the environmental attributes because we're all connected to the same natural gas grid. So Des Moines puts it in here, San Diego takes it out here. They're not using the same exact molecules, but that still lessens the overall need of gas to come out of the ground, because we're looking at the gas system as basically a big sink. So that's a big advantage for RNG, is you don't have to sell the gas molecules to your neighbor. You don't have to produce that ethanol and truck it to your location. You can actually inject it, displace the molecules there, and then sell it and get the carbon benefit anywhere else that's connected to the grid. And that's really facilitating the development of RNG. I think lastly is what's holding it back. It's certainly feedstock availability, it's cost. And now there's a competitive nature with these dairy and hog manure, where all of these developers are going out to farmers and saying, I can do this great project, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna cut you in on some of the profits, you have to give me your manure. And farmers are saying, well, is that true? Is that gonna happen? Should I work with you? Should I work with you? Should I work with you? So just that analysis and understanding and education at the farmer level takes some time as well. So we're probably in the second or third inning of this RNG game, if it's a baseball analogy. We've got a long ways to go. We've got a lot of potential. Big picture, there's a lot of studies out there that show, I said, while we could replace 100% of the natural gas in the pipeline, it's probably realistically and economically about 10%. So we're not saying RNG is the end-all be-all solution, just like wind and solar is not, just like ethanol is not. RNG can be one piece of the puzzle that helps us in this overall pace to decarbonize the energy sector, the transportation sector, the industry, food and beverage manufacturing. All of them can use RNG as a substitute for the fossil natural gas that they may be consuming to make their own products.
Okay. Bryan, I'm gonna start this out by asking you a specific question, because I always never understood this. Why is the biogas from a, you said wastewater facility, more value than a landfill biogas?
It depends a little bit, but mostly there's some leakage at the landfill. So even though it's covered, a certain percentage of that gas is being emitted, and you get penalized that from a carbon intensity scoring. Where you go into a wastewater treatment plant, that thing really has to be airtight to work. And so your emissions, your methane losses are very, very small in a digester. Also, the gas quality coming out of a wastewater plant, you have to do less to it to clean it up. It takes more energy to take that raw landfill gas. There's a lot of other stuff in there, and that takes more energy, and that extra energy increases the carbon emissions from that. But close, but a little bit better.
All right, at this time, this is where the discussion comes involved. We're gonna open up the panel to questions from the audience. So, open it up to questions. Just raise your hand.
And if you would, tell us who you are.
Yes, that'd be great.
That'd be great. I already know the first two people I saw raise their hands. In case there's some other people I don't know, please tell us who you are.
Yeah, my name is Sievers. I work for Slipstream, Director of Education and Training, very involved with energy efficiency and utility programs and education. I'm curious about transportation sector because I live in Madison. We have landfill. In the landfill, of course, they inject into the main pipeline, but the Dane County use a lot of RNG for heavy snowplow and heavy utility vehicles. That's how they are making more profit because they're not using diesel and not buying fuel, right? So I'm curious from Iowa, what's happening in RNG and transportation sector.
I think, I know there are, you know, some natural gas vehicles out there that could then run on the RNG. As far as I know, we don't have any specific fueling stations, you know, dedicated to RNG. You know, I think probably the value of pipeline injection has been a better return on investment than using it in the vehicles for most of the few producers that we have. But you know, but it's certainly again part of the piece of you know, that transportation sector, decarbonizing the transportation sector.
Yeah, I think Iowa's been, heavy duty vehicles have been relatively slower to convert over from diesel consumption here than they have in other parts of the country. There's certainly some, there's a lot of fleets. Amazon uses a lot, UPS, Waste Management, they all are heavily relying on natural gas vehicles that all burn RNG. And so there is quite a bit of that in Iowa. It might not be as much as in California or in other areas, but I think that benefit of RNG too is it can come in and satisfy that demand, and if there's not enough of that, it can just go out there and used as thermal heat, you know, process energy heat too.
And one last question is about landfill. So you mentioned about compressing that gas, making it at a quality which you can put into the main pipeline, right? It's energy intense.
Yep.
So if your energy source is clean, or you have a windmill, or you have solar panels enough to cover, then that carbon emission will come further down.
Exactly. Yeah, that carbon intensity score is really a score of the entire life cycle of the facility, of the feedstocks, of the transportation, and where you're going to use it. So you're trying to measure the emissions of, if you really want to widen it, you know, how much truck traffic does it take to bring that material into the landfill? How much diesel do they consume? When you're moving and operating a landfill, what's the energy associated with that? And then looking at the energy associated with dealing with the biogas or the landfill gas and upgrading that. So if you can use wind and solar instead of grid electricity, that's going to reduce the carbon intensity score of the facility or of the gas that you're producing.
Interesting. And I have also seen in Wisconsin, especially in Dane County, those trucks goes from biodigester, they get the gas, they come to the landfill, we have a station where they dump the gas, it's go back into the pipeline. What is the process in Iowa between your digester, and do you have any process where you can collect the gas, put in the main pipeline, like these farmers, then you know they can connect with the main hub?
Yeah, I think it goes a lot back to what Shelly was saying, is economics drive those decisions. And so that pipeline interconnect, you know, to connect into, we have Mid-American here, Mid-American Energy or Reliant Energy here, to make that high pressure injection pipe connection can be like several $1 million. And so when you're trying to make this work at some smaller scale, what people do, and a lot in Wisconsin, with all the dairy farms that are spread out, one, the utilities up there, We Energies, it took them a little longer to let a lot of that gas into the pipeline, and so you had less places you could go. So what would happen is you're going to generate all that RNG at the farm level. You're going to fill up a tanker truck, and you're going to drive that, and you're going to put it into those locations. that also increases the carbon intensity score because there's emissions associated with it, with doing that, and just logistically. But that's certainly viable. There's people in Iowa that are collecting that and hauling it. It's really, maybe you're not near a natural gas pipeline, so you have to do that. It's, you know, that tap's expensive, but so is, you know, 10, 20 miles of high pressure gas line too. So you really have to do the economics of, should you truck it somewhere and kind of have that higher carbon intensity score, or can you do something right on site? It's very, very case by case and site specific.
Thank you.
Good question.
Ann?
Thank you. I've been a fan of RNG for a long time.
This is Ann Kimber from Iowa State.
I'm the director of the Electric Power Research Center at Iowa State, and we've really gotten into microgrids.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know, I guess my general question is how scalable, I know it's more expensive, there's probably a sweet spot of economics, but can you do it at smaller scales so that you're working with rural communities, maybe rural electric cooperatives or small municipal utilities that have old generation, and somehow you're replacing that with RNG local generation that then becomes part of a local microgrid. Have you thought about that? And then I had two other questions. I remember when I was first learning about RNG that there was a problem with siloxanes. I guess that's all been solved now?
No, that's part of the cost.
Yeah, it's
Part
just,
of the cost to
Yeah.
clean that. And
Yep.
my other question, back in the day when I was very excited about this, is that the farmers were really concerned about biosecurity, and I figure you've solved that one by now. No, that's another.
it's also,
Wow.
yeah, the biosecurity issue is an issue, but I think what the people, when you're taking manure from a
Can
bunch
you
of
explain
different.
what you mean by biosecurity?
Yeah, so-
Is that-
So, we actually toured some hog farms, you know, in our process of exploration. I think your boss was out at one with us. And I was so, I didn't realize the security, you know, like full protective gear. I think you've probably all heard about, you know, the bird flu and how contagious that is. Huge issues on hog farms as well. You know, that's an asset they need to protect and don't want any cross-contamination in there.
So you're talking about the health of the animal breeding infectious diseases?
Right, and also what's in the manure that comes out of that animal, how might that affect the farmland on which you're disposing of it? So it's a major issue, and you know, I think a lot of it though too is just a mindset adjustment for farmers, that can it be done? And that's one of the things that I think over the last 5 or 6 years, we've done a lot of education as well, and taken some of that fear out of it.
Yeah, I think too, when you're building, like, let's say you're taking 8 or 10 farms and combining it into one, making sure you site that right. I think that the brilliance of on-farm digesters and what you're doing is really just taking the manure is going to some kind of manure treatment now. It's usually like that lagoon or that deep pit. All the digester is doing is interrupting that, and it wants to pull the energy out and then return the nutrients back to the farmer. So it's really not disrupting the overall cycle too much. But when you start mixing all of that, and then you're asking a farmer to take on nutrients or manure from somebody else's farm when that biosecurity is a big issue, it's definitely an issue, but there's ways to mitigate it. A lot of training, on a lot of site protections where you can't visit multiple farms in a given day or two period.
Can I ask one more question?
Well, if you don't mind though, the microgrid part.
Yeah.
Yeah, address the rest of the
Yeah,
question.
if you don't mind, I'll jump in
Go ahead.
because the microgrid part, since this is a distributed resource, it's where the parallels of the wastewater side of what I'm doing for rural Iowa intersects with this conversation, because one of the things we want to do for small town lagoons is to bring, containerized biology to supplement, you know all about this because you've been working with BES Water Solutions on that. So you bring in a 40-foot container, it's got some biology in there, supplements what the lagoons can do, and you get better water quality discharges from that, hopefully more affordably. Same can go, they make now, these days, that same kind of technology advancements that make those containers viable there for anaerobic digestion. And so the same company we're working with to do it aerobically for lagoons, they make containerized anaerobic digesters now, which are much more amenable to location with microgrids. And that's the fundamental question to me. What are you gonna do with that methane if you've got a relatively small source, and if you don't have too many siloxanes and other things, and you can generate electricity on site, how can you then push that out? And so, I think we're getting to the point where, there are some potential shifts in the market, and that's partly what we want to take advantage of too, because then potentially you wouldn't have to ship the feedstock all the way somewhere else. Perhaps you could do the microgrid approach, make all that electricity on site and push it out. Maybe someday that'll be economical too.
Same thing with battery storage, fuel cells. I mean, it's
Exactly.
all possible. It's just not at the economic stage where it's going to be at that micro level. So that's why I think we're starting by, let's just produce the biogas. There's a lot of benefits for biogas. There's a lot of markets you can monetize that. There's been billions and billions of dollars, like BP spent almost $5 billion acquiring a biogas company, and Chevron acquiring RNG and others. There's a big push even from oil majors to be in as part of this energy transition. And once we get in and start just creating much of this energy, then I think the version 2 and the version 3 are gonna be, how do we best utilize that? And that could be locally, that could be, at a state level, could be at a national level. And right now people are actually making RNG and liquefying it and producing renewable liquefied natural gas and shipping it to Europe because they have a really, really high appetite for those environmental attributes there. So we're now all going from like a small microgrid level to a worldwide stage as options to sell RNG. It's going to be a really, really good future for where the potential is going forward.
To build on that, I think we also have to account for the potential supply chain impacts for the state of Iowa. Bryan and I are with the Economic Development Authority. In addition to energy, we try to keep our eye on economic development. We do have a manufacturer in Iowa that makes that scrubber equipment for renewable natural gas. They're out in Dubuque. And also we've recently funded a project for a startup company that makes, we call it the Roomba for the anaerobic digester. It'll go in and clean the tank. So I think Craig's working with that project as well. So, in addition to the energy value, the potential water quality value, there's some economic development potential for the state that we're trying to factor into these decisions as well.
I'm gonna totally steal the Roomba for anaerobic digestion. That is brilliant. I'm stealing that right now.
And did you have another question?
I feel I should give other people a chance.
Okay. Bryan?
I have more of a plug because Shelly,
Bryan, you want to say who you are?
Bryan Sellinger with the Iowa Energy Office, Iowa Economic Development Authority. But I always want to plug this. We have some resources financially that Shelly helps with, Craig helps us with as part of the Iowa Energy Center, and so does Dan. But it's specific to RNG, but it could be other topics. But we have funding available. If anybody comes across some innovative projects on RNG, we can do two things. We have funding for feasibility studies and assessments to assess that opportunity. But we also have a revolving loan fund that can help build the energy infrastructure, including RNG. So we have financial resources.
And we have grants for research.
And we have grants for research. We have these opportunities. We're always looking for unique partnership opportunities, and we're very diverse in our energy mix. But RNG is one that we're saying, hey, if people have an interest, reach out, talk to us. So.
Yes, sir.
My name is Milton Owen. I'm just a retired private citizen interested in being able to advocate a little more intelligently about renewable energy. When you talk about pipelines to bring manure facility, capabilities together in one location, what are you talking about economics of scale? How many lives to measure head of livestock, the number of pigs and gallons of waste produced? How do you measure that? What's the economics if you were to put all that in one location?
One time we came up with a number that you'd need at least 30,000 hogs if you were to have a single location site. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think to really make it a no-brainer, it's probably like closer to 100,000, 75 to 100,000. You can make it work if you're close to a pipeline, if you're close to the source, you can make it work at a smaller scale, but somewhere in that range.
And I think, a more typical size in Iowa might be 7,500 to 10,000 hogs at a location. So we actually did some we called it a heat map. Where are the farms? How many can you connect with a line. But that's a solution that developers are putting their minds to, you know, the people who want to invest in these projects.
So what you're basically saying is a digester will work on a smaller scale, it's just not economic.
Exactly,
Exactly.
100%.
It
Yeah.
doesn't
That's why
take
you're collecting it all
70,000 to Make a
together.
digester work,
Yep.
yeah,
That's,
fine.
we get a question all the time of why is North Carolina and Missouri and other areas so far ahead of Iowa? It's because they have huge, like 100, 200,000 head farms, and we're at the 7,500, 10,000 head farm, and no one's really cracked the nut of how to bring that all together economically. Although I think people are getting closer and people are doing that clustering effect, but then that's either going to take pipeline, manure pipelines, or it's going to take trucks on the road, and pipelines aren't, that's a controversial, it's controversial. And the other example is you're putting trucks on the road to move, manure back and forth, and that's not a perfect solution either.
And I've heard we're calling them gathering lines because
Gathering
it's
lines.
less controversial.
Yeah. And
And they are small and,
Small.
and low pressure. And either you're moving the manure or you're moving the raw biogas. You've got, which is the, the least of the issue, you can go either way.
Yes.
So Scott Drake, Mid-American Energy. Question on total potential for Iowa then. With all of the proposed projects, like, is there an anticipated baseline of energy that could be provided from RNG for the future?
That's a good question.
The number I run with is that 10% really, is I think a reasonable 10% of the natural gas supply could come from RNG. Is the number we hear. Is it, right now it's sub 1%, but again,
We're at 1%.
we're not even probably at 1%, but there's a lot of room to grow there. Other utilities, SoCal Gas and California, have come out and made claims where they're going to say 50% of our pipeline will contain RNG by, I don't remember the exact date, 2040 or something like that. And so they're going to say, we're going to make an effort, and we're going to have to pay more for that. They're going to incent that development in their own backyard because now there's an extra way to make those economics work. It's a payment from SoCal Gas. So some of that's, what policy do you put in place in order to drive it? If you just let the free market take care of it, we may be able to get to 5 to 10% over the next decade.
And your follow-up question?
I guess I keep thinking about FERC Order 2222, that allows distributed resources to play in energy markets in a way that they haven't been able to do with aggregation. And that's a long time in the future, but that's a whole nother, now you have to have a small scalable electricity generator that's running on RNG, but you're bidding that into the future energy markets. Do you guys study that as well? It seems really messy.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, it's all feasible. I mean, it's been done, but I think it just comes down to, right now, the incentives are more for, the pipeline injection. But, the technology's there, the feedstocks are there.
Yeah, and I think generally how the market works for renewable natural gas is the molecules are going to stay local. So you avoid transporting RNG across state lines, because the molecules, if we put it in Des Moines and it goes in the pipeline, it's going to be used in this general area. The attributes are going to be detached, and then they're going to be sold in San Diego or somewhere else. So we're not physically moving molecules from Des Moines to San Diego, but that concept, that whole displacement concept, is what has worked for renewable natural gas. Electricity, you have a REC program. I think people are trying to still fully figure out what's the best approach to that. But from a natural gas perspective, the couple hundred projects have really figured out how to get around. It's not the right word, but it's how do you support the system that's in place, because we're not moving gas across state lines in in a vast majority of the cases.
I have kind of a two-part question, I guess.
Name an organization.
I'm Danielle Roseland, and I'm with the Department of Natural Resources Pollution Prevention Services. So what's the current status of the grid? And moving forward incrementally, I mean, we're not gonna go from today being at this state to tomorrow having it fully implemented. What is the low-hanging fruit steps that we can do to move forward either at like the farm level or the manufacturer level?
It's a great question. I think
Do
for
you mean
me,
the electric grid or the pipeline network? Because actually, Iowa's got, as far as natural gas pipeline, miles of pipeline, we're on the upper end to other states. But you know, on the electric grid side, that's in Kimberly, we've got lots of concerns. You know, whether it's EV loads, heat pump loads, this whole electrification piece. Some of the
And we are having actually a discussion, so one of the breakouts is
Yeah.
the grid.
Yeah.
And-
yeah, so some of the things, yeah, that the speaker this morning said are true and somewhat alarming.
I think from the natural gas side though, it's a great setup where
Yeah.
the infrastructure is already there. And all we're doing is not pull the fossil molecules out of the ground, and we're gonna use renewables, same volumes. You don't really have to change behaviors or habits. You don't have to build a lot of infrastructure. Maybe from the biogas or the RNG production facility to the grid, that's what you're gonna have to do. But once you're there, you're relying on the infrastructure, you're relying on marketers, companies like Mid-American to distribute it. We're really not disrupting that, assuming we can get the quality of that renewable natural gas to match, or to 99% match the qualities of the gas that those entities are used to burning or transmitting.
Yeah, and for me, it'd be that upper left image I had on my slide was, supporting better biogas formation. We're doing it so ad hoc as far as I'm concerned, that if we could, it's low-hanging fruit to increase some of these places by like 25%,
Yeah.
like just with some, what I would consider relatively simple tech support. The other thing, we've been talking about the expense of scrubbing biogas. So, I do microbiology for a business, for a living, at least one of the things we do. And I talked about some of these supplements. There are ways to add things to digesters to make even more methane while we're reducing hydrogen sulfide, like sulfur content in the biogas, which is expensive to scrub out. So if we can take advantage of some of these low-hanging fruit techniques and get those out into the operator space where these biodigesters are being run, we can produce more better quality biogas that then obviously gives you more commodity value in the end, more that profitability piece that seems so mysterious. I think it becomes more predictable and more profitable, in which, I think that's a relatively low-hanging fruit.
One of the nice things about RNG is not forcing you to choose between a fossil fuel and electrification, because it is, the same. And there's some things that just are gonna be tough to electrify. Some of the heavy industrial processes, those thermal loads, are just gonna be really hard to electrify. So we've got an option here, and unfortunately this morning's speaker didn't, we should have asked him, what about RNG?
What about RNG?
Okay, real quick.
One question. Dave Johnson, Mid-American Energy, and I'm not an engineer, but in terms of the molecules that are getting injected into the pipeline, and this is probably a bigger question than just the state of Iowa, but is there a universal standard for the RNG that gets injected into the pipeline that is broadly accepted by all utilities?
We need quick answers.
No.
Every-
Every utility
No.
figures it out themselves right now. Like, I know National Grid in the Northeast has tried to put a general standard that utilities in their territory and areas could follow. So there's guidance out there for people, but generally it's whatever you all say the quality needs to be. You can pretty much clean up anything, within reason. It's just, it could be extra costly to do
Is there
that.
anybody working on something like that?
Not that I know of, no.
Well, we're gonna have to end it there today to keep us on schedule. I'd like to thank all our speakers, and let's give them a round of applause.